Hi everyone, good evening. Welcome to the fourth Mastering Landscape in Revit session, live session. Welcome to all of you who joined us, or if you guys are joining us in the recorded session, watching us after the event. Hi Utam.
Hi, how are you doing?
Great. So good evening, good morning to whoever you are, wherever you are. We're glad to have you on board. This session, we're going to deal with a very interesting topic. So, if any of you watched any of my tutorials or demo sessions before, or really watched anything that I ever, any session that I did about Revit, you know that there is one principle that I always talk about. I always say it all the time, and this principle is the not one big surface principle. So in this session, we got a question actually from one of our viewers last week, and he asked, so how do you apply this principle on top of the existing ground, the existing survey data? And I thought that's a really good question, and I will dedicate this session to that topic. So, as as you
Can I
can see
say
over
can I say
here,
something?
yes, of course.
So just like Nehama said, we are very aware of your guys' questions. Sometimes we can't actually answer all of them, but if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the chat. And there is actually a chance that we'll do a full episode dedicated to whatever question you may have. So, hi everyone again. Please feel free to write whatever you want in the chat. Um, we're here, it's evening for us, but yeah, throughout the day, you can tell us where you're from, what's your name, introduce yourselves, and yeah, Nehama, your go.
Great. So I always talk about the not one big topo surface principle, and that's a super important principle. And it actually applies not only if you work with Revit, but for any 3D landscape model. Your model is not just one big surface, just like the building is not just one big surface, big chunk of concrete or something, right? It has walls, windows, railings, doors, and very much the same. We have, all the different parts, all the different design elements that compose the landscape. Each of them has a unique material, slope, function, and we have to preserve it. So in the last session, Alex asked us how to apply this principle in landscape models that have existing survey data. By the way, it's exciting to see where people are from, so keep writing that in the chat. I like seeing it. So how do we apply this principle to an existing survey data file? Basically, the session today is going to be more of a workflow session than a specific tool tutorial. And I think that you will find out that the workflow is very intuitive and the approach is straightforward. I'm going to show it on Revit 2023, but this applies basically to all versions of Revit. Before I dive into the workflow, I want to say that this is a workflow that I developed, which means that it is the best ever. However, if you have any comments, if you do something differently, I would love to hear about it in the chat or in the comments of this YouTube. Another thing that I want to say is that you should be very conscious of how you apply this workflow and what exactly is the specific need of your project. What do you want to be able to take out of your model? That being said, let's jump right into the workflow. So I actually prepared these two slides to explain how I approach a new project. Basically, there are two main scenarios that we can relate to. The first one happens in 98% of the projects, I think, right? And then the second one is in 2% of the projects. However, you will see that the workflow applies to both of them in slightly different ways, and I'll show both of these scenarios. So the first scenario is where we're actually modifying the entire project area, the work limit or the property line, whatever you want to call it. But in most of the landscape projects, we will actually find ourselves modifying every part of the ground that is within our work limit. Now, even if it's a very small modification, just placing a tiny rockery element and changing the ground slightly, that's a totally new element when we're talking about modeling our beam model. And that's especially important in beam models because the beam model, the information of our model wants to know what's the existing ground and what's new. So applying these principles will make it a lot easier for you to understand how to model throughout the project. So that's the first scenario, and I'm telling you, most of your projects will be first scenario. The second scenario is that you want to preserve most of the ground. Maybe it's somewhere in a nature reserve. Maybe it's somewhere, you know, that you just want to preserve and make small modifications. And in this case, I'll show you exactly what I do. It's pretty similar. So I took it upon myself to kind of walk you through the steps of establishing a project with the existing survey data. And when I'm saying survey data, I usually means that it's a CAD survey, it could be a Civil 3D survey, but it also can be a Revit survey. You know, a lot of surveyors these days are giving you Revit files, and that will be great as well. That will work the same. So let's go through the steps and we'll do it slide, Revit, Revit, slide, one by one. So the first step, like every project, is to model the existing ground. I prepared here a demonstration that's a Revit project. And before we dive into the first step, I'm going to state the obvious, right? So the first obvious is that you work with model phases, with project phases. Let's go to manage phases. I only have existing and new construction. This would probably be in your template already. Some projects might have different phases than others. This is something that you have to do at the beginning of the project with your BIM manager. So that's just, you know, stating the obvious that you have different phases in your projects. Now, when I start a work, I always have dedicated views for these phases. So you can see here that I have plan view and a 3D view of the existing situation. And I have a plan view and a 3D view of my proposed design. And we'll talk about it in a second. So in the scenario that I'm showing over here, my survey data is a CAD file. And I'm already working within shared coordinates. I already did this entire process of acquiring my coordinates using, you know, the environment set coordinates tool. By the way, we will add in the description a few other links that are showing you how to work with earthwork calculation or with set coordinates tool. So all this information would not be included in today's presentation, but we'll definitely refer you to other videos that show that.
Yeah, I
So
wanted to
in my
say,
case,
can I also say one more thing? First of all, that. Second of all, just because Dustin asked, what if we don't have any survey data? So specifically, this video is to show you how to work with based on a survey that you already have. We will also link other tutorials because your question was, is there other methods to create contours? And the answer is yes, many. So you can do it based on your own measurements, on just, you know, pure drawing lines from any edges that you have that you already know of. We'll attach it also on the links below at the end of the video.
Mhm. Yeah, and just like Itam said, feel free to, you know, shoot these questions out there and we'll try our best to answer. So let's start. The first step is to model your existing survey data. Let's go to 3D view of the existing site, and you can see that, again, this view is allocated to the existing stage, phase. So how to model a survey from a CAD file. I'm sure most of you are familiar. We just go to Messing Inside, Topo Surface, Create from Import. And again, that works pretty similarly in Revit 2024. Select Import Instance. I'm going to select my CAD survey. And in this case, I know that these are the layers of my contour lines. Click on OK. And I have my existing ground. I'm going to approve it. You can see that I don't see it in the new construction phase. I only see it in the existing phase. And now the interesting part. So what I do all the time, and that's not a must, but I do it and it works perfectly. It makes a lot of sense to me. I'm immediately gonna set it as demolished. So I'm gonna set everything as demolished, even if I'm not demolishing everything, even if I'm just, modifying this area within this square, I'm gonna set everything as demolished. And you'll see in a second how it works. So here's my surface, phase created existing, phase demolished, new construction. And now here's the interesting part. So the second step is to duplicate the existing ground into the new phase. And we're just going to add a comment to that so we will be able to see this information. So I'm going to select this existing ground. Let's call it existing ground, right? I'm going to select it, copy the clipboard, and then I'm going to go to the new construction phase and paste a line to same place. Let's go to the 3D view. So now I have exactly the same topography in the existing phase and in the new construction phase. So the reason for that, why do I duplicate it? I'm duplicating it because first, I want to have only one existing surface in my entire project. Otherwise, Revit is going to be really confused. And second is because this is the surface that I'm going to do a bunch of stuff on. So I don't want to have it as my existing surface. So what I'll do in the comments of this surface, I'm just going to add existing ground and then call it new. So adding these comments would allow me to later, when I schedule stuff, it allows me to filter them out and to understand what surface is which. And I get a really good question here from Alonso. Why not use the graded region feature? Well, the graded region feature does basically just what I did, but manually. There are a few reasons why I don't like it. The first and really, the first reason that I don't like it is that it just duplicates a surface from one phase to another. And that's counterintuitive for a lot of people. You have to understand what you're doing. And then the second is that the graded region feature suggests that you work with one big surface, and that's something that we're not doing. So with simply copy paste, that's it. That's the entire thing that the graded region feature is doing. And now I'm going to move to the existing site, and that's where I'm at. So the next step is to model other site constraints. Now that's a very important thing in landscape in general. It doesn't matter if you work on Revit or if you're just drawing on a paper. The one thing that you have to have before you even start to design is your constraints. And what do I mean by constraints? Constraints could really be anything. They could be Civil 3D roads. They can be an architectural linked building, or they could just be the boundaries of your site, of the existing ground. But basically, the most important thing is to model your constraints before we start. For me, it'll just be the existing ground and this architectural survey. Now, the next step would be to erase the disturbed area. And that's where you have to understand what your project is all about. So, as I said before, in 99% of the projects, what you're actually doing, let's go to the new construction site plan. What you're actually doing is modifying everything that's within your project area. So whether I'm going to have, a bunch of pathways over here and rockery elements and maybe a wall at this side, it doesn't matter. Everything here is going to change. And as long as I know that it's going to change, I'm going to delete it. So how do I do it? In Revit 2023, I'm going to go to split surface. In Revit 2024, I could just split the toposolid with the modify split command. So I'm in 2023. I'm just going to go to massing inside, split surface, select this surface. And with the pick line tool, I'm just going to select my property line. For some reason, I can't tab select my property line, which is pretty annoying. But I'll do it really quickly. All right, so now I'm just gonna go and delete it entirely. And that's how I start every project. Basically, I'm using this existing ground as the constraints to my design. Now, a really nice thing, and we'll add this tutorial in the description, a really nice behavior of Revit topo surfaces is that if you have an existing surface over here and then a new surface in the other phase, you will immediately be able to see the cut and fill calculation for each of those elements. And you can see that there are slightly a small amount of cut and fill calculation to my existing ground, even though I didn't change it. And that's just because when I split the surface, Revit adds some additional points and that makes small modifications to it. But I'm not going to take it into account in my schedule because I know that this is the existing ground. Right? So that's how I start every one of my projects. And now let's just see an example of what I would do next. So the next step would be to just start model your proposed site. And that's your design process. Each and every one of you would do it differently. Some of you might, draw it in hand and scan it and put it in Revit. Others would just start to play with the model. But just for the sake of the example, let's go to the topography tools, sorry, and say I want to take the from edge tool, and let's say I'm just designing a pathway that goes from here to, I don't know, somewhere here, or maybe add one other points. All right, so let's say that this is a pathway that I'm designing. And let's do, just for the sake of the example again, just maybe another pathway that goes from this part of the building to this part of our existing ground. That's another pathway. And you could just go on like that. You could just go on like that, maybe I don't know, add a lawn area or a gardening area.
Which
In
is,
the
by the
middle
way,
of these.
I'm referring back to Alonso's question. Basically, we at Arc Intelligence and Department for Revit in general do believe that it's easier and more accurate to design your site with separate topographies. So later on, when you need to calculate your earthwork calculations, cut and build, etc., and even just to define different materials for each, like Nehama is showing right now, because it's a question that we get a lot. Like, why not just using the graded region tool? That's the first question people ask us. And the answer is because it's easier to separate and divide your site into smaller.
Exactly. It's not, and I want to say it's not only easier, again, it's
Yeah.
correct. It's BIM, all right? Imagine walking in the street and imagine that the sidewalk and the road and the gardening area would be just the same surface. It doesn't happen in reality. It's not like that. So the pathway has its own slopes, its own materials, and its own functions, and same goes for the gardening bed. And also, if you're asking yourself, but I'm using floors, not topographies, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to use topographies. You could just use floors. But you're not using just one big surface. And again, I'm going back to the demonstration project. This is my existing ground over here. And you can see how the design in the middle just makes a lot of sense, right? So now, the main thing that the graded region, gave us is allowing us to see the cut and fill quantities of what we're doing within the site. But we don't need this for that, because as long as we have new topography over covering an existing topography, we can click on it, and in the topography properties, we can always see the net cut and fill of every design element. And again, that's not the topic for today. And you're gonna see a tutorial for that in the description, but that's definitely possible. It's the same in Revit 2024, except in Revit 2024, we have a different parameter to allow you to accommodate this workflow. But in my experience, it makes it a lot easier for people to design and model landscape if they're just thinking about it piece by piece, just stitching and sewing the landscape. And this is a principle that I keep repeating, in every presentation. I think it's very, very important. So that's the first workflow. Before I go ahead and answer some of your questions, I just want to briefly show you the second scenario and how we do that. So in the second scenario, we're actually doing everything just the same. And as I said before, you don't have to do it just the way I do, but trust me, it's the best. I've done so many of those, and it gets so confusing, especially far into the project. If you do it this way, everything would be organized, and everything would just make sense as you go throughout the project phases. So you don't have to do it the way I do, but you better.
Yeah,
I don't know how else to say
Nehama
that.
is always right. So be careful. She knows where you
Right.
live.
So, right. So that's the second scenario. And the second scenario is, that you want to preserve as much of the landscape and just make very, surgically small modifications to the ground. And that's from another tutorial that I created. It will be again in the description. But if we go ahead and take a look at the 3D existing site, then you can see that I modeled the existing site in just the same way. And then I went ahead and created this path that I wanted to design. And I just created a topography under the path that shows me the cut and fill calculation for this very, very specific area. So again, I didn't need to make a modification to the huge topography, and then every point I stretches 1,000 points. It makes no sense. Just design an element and place it over there. And you can see that this method allowed me to also see what area is my disturbed area. How much am I changing? How much am I modifying in the ground? And I'm able to see that on top of my existing ground, and of course get my schedule with the cut and fill quantities. So, that's a very simple workflow. Just model your existing site, duplicate it, erase, get your constraints, erase your disturbed area, and start your project. I can assure you that following these very, very simple steps of workflow at the beginning of every project would make your work a lot easier, and it will make things make much more sense. Sorry for my English right now. And that's following a lot of research. So I guess that's a good time for questions. Yotam, were there any interesting questions
Yeah. I
out
will
there?
start with Sujit. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. And that's just a quick one. He asked, does Arc Intelligence provide any Revit courses? So the answer is not exactly. We do provide a lot of training. There's free training and a lot of tutorials that you can find online for environment for Revit. We do have local resellers, and you can go to our website and look at your just search for your region or country, and we will suggest local resellers that will provide Revit's training. So I hope that answers your question. If not, like if you don't have a local reseller, of course you can probably just Google it, and there's many people who provide Revit training. Um,
Yeah, but if
yes,
you don't find your way around stuff, I do invite you to send us an email.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So Eric asks, first of all, he does, yes, Harsh, real quick, this video will be available on YouTube later. And we will all the models that you've seen that Nehama has shared, either the path that leads from the villa to the sea, or the little complex that you saw from the survey. We will share the tutorials of how we did them in the description below. It will probably be available tomorrow. So come back tomorrow and check it out. Eric said that first of all, they're not using Revit 2024 as of yet, so it's good because we're demonstrating on Revit 2023 right now. But draping floors to your help topo surface, what are the offsets for roads, for grass, for sidewalks, etc., that you do? So that's mostly
That's a good question. And I guess the answer is that it depends on the construction detail. So, for example, it depends on the path. All right. So, my regular detail is to have something like 6 centimeters of paving, and then 10 centimeters of um, I don't even know the English term of it, but the thingy that holds the paving. It could sometimes it's concrete, sometimes it's gravel, but usually in Israel we start to calculate about 15 to 20 centimeters
yeah,
under the pavement, and
the
that's something
foundation.
like what you see here. But it really depends on your local standards. Oh, yeah, I'm kind of showing it over here. So that's what we usually do. It depends on your local standards. And again, I'll show I'll share the tutorial in the description, but you can see that, for example, here, my method was to model the floor in the thickness that I want to get before I start the earthwork calculation, and then I'll just create the surface, the topo surface under that. Sorry, let's hide the floor for a second so you can see. So I basically created the topo surface to calculate the earthwork under this floor. And I get to that in later stages of my design when I have to show these documents or show these quantities. Yeah. So I hope that answers that.
Yeah. Anas asked if you don't have a CAD file for site topography, um, what's the best way to model the landscape? And the answer is you have many options. My best recommendation right now is to actually watch our previous mastering landscape in Revit. We actually went through a few methods to design basically the topography without any reference from survey file. So that would be best. Um,
Yeah, I think he was asking, is there any other place where you can get an existing survey? And
uh,
I think there are a few plugins that are doing that. Actually, I want to say that I think lately I saw a really good tutorial with if you know Balkan Architect. So if you're here, hi. I think I saw a really good tutorial that shows a plugin that can actually extract it's not an accurate survey data, so your most accurate data will always be to send a surveyor to the site and to get the survey data from him or her. But there are some plugins or software, and we could cover this topic if you want, There are some plugins or software that allow you to get existing site data just to start your project. Yeah.
Wow, Eric shares their workflow, which is we get our adjacent and existing site context from InfoWorks, then they export that as FBX file and import that into Format Pro, then import the CAD and into Revit and change the file type into AXM. Hopefully, the workflow that we just suggested will work better for you. I do think it's
But also good news. We're working on a tool that will allow you to take stuff straight from InfraWorks into Revit. I'm not sure if you could export from InfraWorks to LandXML, but if you can, then you could just turn it into Revit topography using the external civil data command. So as I said, there are many different ways of getting your survey data, but I personally did not really like Formit, but it just depends why do you do this workflow, and if the main reason is not being able to go from InfraWorks to Revit, then we would love to hear from you. Maybe email us, and it'll help us, maybe make this workflow a little bit easier for you. Yeah. And hi, Eric. I mean, we see you a lot, so thanks.
And actually, there are no more questions. If any of you guys have anything else to offer, suggest, ask questions unrelated to the topic of today, we might address them in future sessions.
Yeah. And if you have a better workflow in mind, then I would love to hear about it. I mean, I'm usually right about everything I say, but if you can prove me wrong, I'll
Yeah,
be happy to hear.
Eric just said that it's based on OpenStreetMap. So this is a lot of the times where the survey is coming. It's
Yeah.
not the best, but
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I've used it in the past too.
And also, I've had issues with the Formit not falling within shared coordinates. But again, that maybe I just didn't get the workflow correct. So that'll be a good thing, a good new thing to learn. Um, Great. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. As usual, if you have ideas or questions for the next sessions, we would love to hear about them. Um, Next week, I would be in London in the Next Build conference. So I'm not sure that we will have a session,
Probably not.
but
Yeah, but
thank
we'll
you all
see
for
you in the week
joining.
after that. And thank you guys for joining us. And um, yeah, check in tomorrow, and I'll update all the links that we've discussed this time. And yeah, thank you, Eric, and thanks everyone. And
Bye.
have a great day and good night. Nehama, you look amazing today too. Forgot to say.
What?
You look amazing also today. I promised you
Oh,
last time that I will tell
thank
you
you.
every
Thank you. I
time.
really felt like I was missing something. All right.
Yeah. I know. Your shirt is great, and it's really. If you guys haven't noticed or you've seen from previous tutorials, Nehama just got a haircut a couple of weeks ago, and it looks great. And
Thanks.
she's now looking like even a younger child than she looked before.
All right. Have a good day or evening.
Good night. Bye.